The chandeliers had not yet dimmed when the first lie took the stage. Adrian Sykes stood at the service entrance, broad shoulders filling a jacket 2 sizes too cheap for the marble hall beyond, watching a donor list update on a tablet he wasn't supposed to see. Names vanished. New names appeared. The paper trail was being scrubbed in real time, and he noted the timestamp with the precision of a man who understood that metadata outlives memory. Somewhere above, in the velvet-roped sanctuary where champagne cost more than his monthly rent, Julian Pembroke was rehearsing generosity for cameras that would broadcast virtue to markets that would reward it. But the whistleblower file, the real one, not the decoy making rounds and whispers, had gone missing from the venue's secure room sometime between 300 and 4 o'clock a.m., and Adrian knew exactly which access log had been deleted because he had watched it happen. He said nothing. He never did, not until the moment cost more than silence. In the basement corridor, where the rich never looked, Phoebe Calloway pushed her mop bucket past him, her hands red from chemical cleaner, her smile costing energy she couldn't spare after another night of caring for her aunt. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of recognition in a world designed to make them invisible to each other, 3 seconds of warmth in a building where warmth was measured in heating bills they couldn't pay. Tonight, under those chandeliers, one of them would be publicly destroyed so that a larger truth could be buried. Tonight, the cost of justice would be measured in humiliation, and the reward for love would be survival, scarred but honest. Stay for the story that proves the quiet ones are never truly silent, they're simply waiting for the right moment to let the floor collapse. The donor list flickered on the tablet one final time before the doors opened, and Adrian watched a name he recognized from regulatory filings vanish into digital ether. He stood at his assigned post near the service elevator, broad shoulders squared against a wall that separated the kitchen's steam from the ballroom's crystal, his eyes tracking the movement of staff like a man cataloging inventory he might need later. Phoebe passed with her cleaning cart, the wheels squeaking on marble that cost more per square foot than her monthly rent, and she didn't look up because looking up meant acknowledging the gulf between her existence and the gowns floating past. Julian Pembroke descended the grand staircase at 7:47 p.m., precisely on schedule, his smile calibrated for maximum warmth at 30 feet and maximum intimidation at 3, his hand finding the small of a senator's wife with the confidence of a man who owned the room's gravity. Adrian noted the security chief's earpiece crackle with a frequency change, noted the 3 guards who suddenly weren't at their assigned posts, noted the way the head of catering received an envelope that disappeared into her apron before she could count what held it closed. The gala was a machine, and machines required lubrication, and Adrian understood that some lubricants were cash while others were silence purchased with threats wrapped in velvet. Phoebe's radio squawked with a location change. She was being moved from the east wing to the west, away from the service corridor that accessed the secure archive room, and she didn't question it because questioning meant losing hours that her aunt's medication required. Adrian watched her go, watched the way her shoulders tightened with the knowledge of another shift extended without overtime pay, and he filed the observation in a mental cabinet labeled with a code only he understood. The doors opened. The donors flowed in. And somewhere in the building, a shredded envelope waited in a trash can that Phoebe would empty in 3 hours, carrying fragments of a truth that could collapse empires if anyone bothered to piece them together. What would she do when she found it, and who would believe a woman who cleaned floors for a living when she spoke of documents that billionaires denied existed? The trash bag weighed less than the secrets it contained, and Phoebe felt the corner of something rigid against her palm as she tied the knot at 11:23 p.m., long after the last limousine had dissolved into the city's fog. She worked alone in the East Wing now, isolated from the other cleaners who laughed in break rooms she couldn't afford to enter, her hands moving through the refuse of people who treated $1,000 centerpieces as disposable as her labor. The envelope had been shredded with purpose, not anger strips too wide for a machine, too narrow for easy reconstruction, the kind of manual destruction that suggested time and panic in equal measure. She recognized the letterhead because her aunt's disability appeal had crossed the same legal firm's desks, the same embossed weight of paper that meant someone had paid for the illusion of permanence. Phoebe didn't read the fragments immediately. She had learned that curiosity in this building led to termination, and termination led to eviction, and eviction led to the kind of homelessness that killed people her aunt's age in winter months. She tucked the strips into her pocket, feeling them crackle against her thigh as she pushed the cart toward the service elevator, where Adrian stood with his clipboard and his silence that somehow felt like protection rather than surveillance. He didn't speak, but his eyes tracked the bulge in her pocket with the precision of a man who noticed everything and judged nothing, and she felt seen in a way that made her want to hide and reveal simultaneously. The elevator doors opened to reveal the basement corridor, that liminal space where class distinctions dissolved into concrete and fluorescent hum, and she stepped inside knowing that the gap between her world and his was measured in what they chose to carry in their pockets. What if the shredded letter was the key to everything the gala had tried to bury, and what would it cost her to find out? Julian Pembroke did not visit the staff break room. He sent his assistant, who distributed white envelopes with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and would do it again. Phoebe received hers at 2:00 a.m., during the 15 minutes she was allowed to sit before returning to the West Wing where the Real work waited, and she didn't open it because she recognized the weight of hush money before she recognized the amount. The note inside was handwritten in a script that suggested personalization while being reproduced by the hundreds. Gratitude for your discretion. The Foundation values loyalty above all. She understood the grammar of threat wrapped in courtesy, the way values became a verb that could be revoked, the way loyalty meant forgetting what she hadn't yet learned. Adrian appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the frame without blocking the exit, and he watched her hold the envelope with the stillness of a man who knew exactly what it contained because he had filed similar envelopes in his own past. He didn't speak, but his nod was microscopic permission to refuse, acknowledgement that refusal would have consequences, recognition that some choices cost more than money could measure. Phoebe thought of her aunt's wheelchair, of the medication that required insurance, that required employment, that required silence, and she felt the envelope grow heavy with the weight of moral compromise. The other cleaners had already pocketed theirs, their eyes avoiding hers because shared complicity was harder to bear than individual guilt, and she understood that Julian's generosity was a net designed to catch everyone who might speak. She tucked the envelope into her apron, unopened, and Adrian's eyebrow rose a millimeter. The only approval she would receive, the only validation that her choice had been witnessed by someone who mattered. But what did it mean that he approved, and what did he know that allowed him to judge the cost of her silence while maintaining his own? The security logs were supposed to be immutable, digital scripture that recorded who accessed what and when, but Adrian had learned long ago that scripture could be edited by those who controlled the servers. He discovered the gap at 3:15 a.m., running a routine check that no event guard should have known how to perform, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who had audited systems far more complex than a charity gala surveillance. The deletion was surgical, not the entire log, which would trigger alerts, but a single entry at 3:47 a.m. the previous night, the precise moment when the whistleblower file had last been scanned by the archive's barcode system. Adrian said nothing. He never did, not yet, because speaking now would reveal capabilities that his uniform wasn't supposed to contain, would transform him from invisible labor into dangerous witness. He printed a screenshot on the security office's oldest machine, the one that didn't log jobs to the central server, and folded it into a pocket that already held 3 similar fragments of evidence he had collected over 6 months of pretending to be exactly what he appeared to be. Phoebe passed the office window, her reflection ghosting across the glass where his own face should have been, and he watched her pause at the archive door, the door she had been reassigned away from, the door that now required a keycard she didn't possess. She tried the handle, as he knew she would, and he watched her shoulders drop with the recognition of exclusion, watched her touch the doorframe with a tenderness that suggested she understood what had been taken from her. Adrian could have opened it. He had the master override, encoded in a sequence he wasn't supposed to know, but revealing it would mean explaining how he knew it, and explanation was the first step toward exposure. He let her walk away, let her believe that the building had simply closed a door, and he wondered if his silence was protection or complicity or the strategic patience of a man who had waited too long to rush now. When would the cost of his hidden knowledge exceed the value of his hidden identity, and who would pay the difference when that equation finally balanced? The accusation came at 8:47 p.m., precisely timed for maximum visibility as the live auction reached its crescendo and cameras panned across faces that would be worth more in publicity than the items being sold. Phoebe had been reassigned to floor duty, her cleaning cart replaced by a silver tray of canapés she was forbidden to taste, her uniform upgraded to a black vest that made her slightly more visible and significantly more vulnerable. Julian Pembroke's voice cut through the chamber music like a blade through silk, not loud but perfectly pitched to carry, his finger extended with the precision of a conductor signaling a downbeat. The bracelet. My mother's bracelet. It's gone, and she was the only staff member in the green room. The spotlight found her before security did, that cruel theatrical beam that transformed human uncertainty into criminal spectacle, and Phoebe felt the heat of it like a physical blow as 200 eyes calculated her guilt based on the cost of her shoes. She didn't speak cold and speak because the grammar of defense required a vocabulary of rights she had never been taught, and because Julian was already producing the evidence, a security photo showing her near the jewelry case during her earlier cleaning rounds. Adrian watched from his post by the service door, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of professional neutrality, but his jaw tightened with a control that cost him visible effort as security guards took Phoebe's arms with the rough efficiency of men who knew she couldn't afford lawyers. The crowd murmured its approval of drama, of justice served swift and theatrical, of the poor being put in their place by the wealthy who funded their employment. Julian's performance of wounded generosity let her go. She's not worth the scandal, but she can never work in this industry again was met with applause that sounded like rain on a coffin, and Phoebe felt her future dissolve in the heat of that spotlight, her aunt's care, her rent, her name, all of it burning away while the rich returned to their bidding. As they escorted her through the kitchen, past Adrian's frozen posture, she caught his eye for 1 second of recognition that this was the humiliation they had both known was coming, the sacrifice that would distract from larger crimes. What had she been moved away from in the archive room, and what truth was being buried under the weight of her public destruction? The mercy came at midnight, delivered not by Julian himself but by his head of security, who found Phoebe in the loading dock where she had been waiting for 3 hours to sign termination papers she couldn't read without glasses she couldn't afford. The offer was simple, spoken in the tone of a man who had delivered similar offers to women who looked like her. Recant your suspicion about the shredded envelope, sign a statement saying you found nothing, and the theft accusation would be reviewed, not dropped, never dropped, but held in abeyance like a sword above her employment record. The strings were visible. She would testify that Adrian Sykes had been overly familiar during his patrols, that he had asked questions about the archive room, that his interest in the gala's security had seemed unprofessional for a man of his position. Phoebe understood the architecture of the trap. Julian wasn't offering mercy, he was manufacturing a scapegoat, and Adrian's broad shoulders were being measured for the costume of fall guy. She thought of the 3 seconds in the corridor, the microscopic nod, the way he had seen her without consuming her, and she felt the weight of betrayal settle in her stomach like spoiled food. The security chief produced a prepared statement, the paragraphs already constructed to sound like her voice while saying nothing she had actually thought, and he placed a pen in her hand with the confidence of a man who had never been refused. If she signed, her aunt's medication continued. If she refused, the theft charge would be filed with police before dawn, and public defenders didn't answer phones at 3:00 a.m. Adrian appeared at the dock's edge, his silhouette backlit by the parking lot's sodium glare, and he didn't approach because approaching would confirm the narrative Julian was constructing, but his stillness was a question. What would she choose when survival required sacrificing the only person who had looked at her like she was visible, and what would remain of her if she chose herself over his hidden purpose? Adrian's moral test arrived not as a moment but as a duration, a sustained pressure that began at 12:15 a.m. and would not release until he made a choice that would destroy either Phoebe or himself. He stood in the security office, watching the footage of her signing the false statement on a monitor that he wasn't supposed to access after hours, his fingers tracing the timestamp with the precision of a man who understood that digital evidence could be authenticated or fabricated depending on who controlled the narrative. He could expose what he knew: the edited logs, the planted bracelet, the systematic deletion of archive access records that proved Julian had been preparing this frame for weeks. Speaking would save Phoebe's name but end his mission. 6 months of infiltration, of pretending to be poor and slow and invisible, all of it wasted because he had developed feelings for a woman who cleaned floors and carried shredded secrets in her pockets. Staying quiet would let her be buried under the weight of a theft she didn't commit, would let Julian's reputation machine grind her into the kind of poverty that killed slowly, would let the whistleblower file remain hidden while its guardian was discredited. Adrian thought of his own reasons for taking this job, the private grief that had driven him to accept the undercover assignment, the promise he had made to someone who would never know if he broke it now for love. He opened his locker, removed the credential fragment he had kept hidden in a hollowed heel, and held it until the plastic edges cut into his palm. Phoebe was being escorted to a waiting car, her future measured in the miles between this building and a police station that would process her without listening, and he had perhaps 90 seconds to decide which version of justice he served. The monitor flickered, showing Julian in his office, smiling at a phone call that confirmed the narrative was already being planted in tomorrow's papers. What would it cost to be the kind of man who chose love over mission, and what would remain of that love if it was purchased with silence? The planted proof appeared at 2:00 a.m., not in the building where it could be traced, but in the inbox of a journalist who had been promised an exclusive on worker theft rings targeting high-end events. Adrian intercepted the packet through methods he couldn't explain without revealing his true capabilities, and he recognized the craftsmanship of professional fabrication bank statements showing Phoebe's aunt's care facility receiving suspicious deposits, emails constructed in her voice demanding hush money, a narrative of opportunism that would make her poverty itself evidence of criminal character. The poor were being framed as predators, their need transformed into motive, their survival instincts recast as calculated greed, and Adrian understood that Julian's machine was designed not just to silence but to destroy the possibility of future credibility. He found Phoebe in the employee parking lot, sitting in a car that wouldn't start, her hands shaking too badly to turn the key, and he approached with his hands visible because after tonight she had learned to fear the approach of anyone in a uniform. He didn't explain how he had obtained the documents, he simply placed them on her dashboard and watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and the particular horror of seeing your own life rewritten by someone who had never lived it. "They're going to publish this," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the first full sentence he had spoken to her in 6 months. "Unless we have something that proves the source." Phoebe touched the fabricated emails, her finger tracing the signature that looked like hers but wasn't, and he saw her understand that Julian had prepared this long before the bracelet, that her destruction had been architected in advance of any crime she might discover. She looked at him then, really looked, and asked the question he had been dreading: "Who are you?" He couldn't answer yet, not with the mission still incomplete, not with the whistleblower file still missing, not with her safety still dependent on his continued invisibility. What would she do when she learned that the man she had trusted was the lie she had been taught to fear, and how would she trust him again when the truth finally emerged? The archive key had been hidden behind the staff-only sign for 11 years, placed there by a janitor who had understood that the best secrets were kept in plain sight, visible only to those who were trained to look at signs rather than through them. Phoebe retrieved it at 3:30 a.m., her fingers finding the magnetic strip by touch alone, her body blocking the security camera she had learned to recognize by the red dot that meant recording. She didn't know what the key opened, only that Adrian's microscopic nod when she mentioned the sign had been permission, had been instruction, had been the first communication in a language they had been developing in silence. The key fit a door in the basement's deepest corridor, behind the boilers where the heat made cameras malfunction and the rich never ventured because the air conditioning didn't reach, and it opened a room that contained not documents but a server rack that hummed with the sound of buried truth. Phoebe understood then that she had been moved away from this room not randomly but specifically, that her cleaning route had been calculated to keep her distant from what Julian feared most, and she felt a strange pride in having been considered dangerous enough to redirect. Adrian found her there, his presence announced by the change in air pressure rather than footsteps, and he didn't stop her from accessing the terminal because the mission had reached a point where her involvement was no longer contamination but collaboration. They worked in the blue light of the screen, their shoulders touching as they searched for the whistleblower file, and she felt the intimacy of shared purpose more acutely than any physical contact they had not yet shared. The file was there, encrypted with a key that Adrian produced from his shoe, and as it decrypted she saw his hands move with the fluency of someone who had done this before, who was trained for this, who was not and had never been merely a security guard. The file contained not just documents but metadata, authentication trails, the digital fingerprints that proved chain of custody and original source, and she understood that love in this context had become evidence, her trust in him, his protection of her, all of it admissible in the court of public and legal opinion. What would it mean to use their connection as a weapon, and what would remain of it after the battle was won? Julian's net tightened with the precision of a man who had practiced this before, who understood that the best traps were built from inconveniences rather than walls. The security checks began at 5 a.m., guards searching bags that had never been searched, demanding identification from staff who had worked there for years, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that made everyone suspect everyone else. False statements appeared in the break room, typed documents claiming that Phoebe had been seen acting suspiciously near donor property, that she had asked questions about valuable storage, that her demeanor had suggested criminal intent, the language of class warfare disguised as security protocol. A staged witness emerged, a donor's wife who claimed to have seen Phoebe pocket something shiny during the gala, her testimony rehearsed to sound spontaneous while hitting every keyword that would trigger police interest. Adrian watched the construction from inside the machine, his uniform granting him access to the planning sessions where Julian's lawyers mapped the narrative arc like screenplay writers pitching a thriller, the sympathetic victim, the grasping employee, the swift justice that would demonstrate the Foundation's commitment to integrity. He couldn't intervene directly without revealing his capabilities, couldn't warn Phoebe without exposing the communication channels he had established, could only watch as the noose was woven from the very fabric of her poverty. She continued to work, her presence in the building now a form of resistance, cleaning the floors where she had been accused, emptying the trash that contained the shredded remnants of Julian's earlier crimes. They met in the service elevator at 6:15 a.m., the camera disabled by a method he didn't explain, and he handed her a phone that contained only one number, a lawyer who didn't exist in any directory, who answered calls at any hour, who specialized in cases that couldn't be won through conventional means. "Don't call until you're ready to lose everything," he said, and she understood that he was offering not just legal protection but the destruction of whatever they had built between them, because lawyers meant discovery, and discovery meant his exposure. What would she risk when the stakes included not just her survival but his secret, and how did one calculate the value of a love that existed only in shadows? The hidden archive was not in the building Julian controlled, but in the one he had forgotten, the original venue, purchased and renovated, its basement still containing the physical records that predated digital systems and the lawyers who managed them. Adrian found the key at 7 a.m., tucked behind a staff-only sign that had survived 3 renovations because no one thought to update the infrastructure of exclusion. He didn't tell Phoebe where he was going because the journey required passing through zones where his presence would be questioned, required using credentials he couldn't explain, required being the person he had been before he pretended to be poor. The archive room smelled of mold and paper, the scent of truth before it was digitized and encrypted and made manageable, and he found the file he needed in a cabinet labeled Maintenance 20092012, the original complaint that had triggered the whistleblower's investigation, the paper trail that Julian's digital scrubbing couldn't reach. He photographed everything with a device that embedded metadata proving time and location, that created the chain of custody that would survive court challenges, that transformed his undercover status from liability to asset. Phoebe was waiting when he returned, not in the building but in the parking lot where her car still wouldn't start, and she watched him approach with the wariness of someone who had learned that his appearances were never accidental. He showed her the photographs, explained the authentication system he had used, revealed more of his capabilities than he had ever intended, and she listened with the stillness of someone storing information against future need. "You're not a security guard," she said, not asking, and he didn't deny it because the time for denials had passed with the rising sun. He told her about the audit, about the 6 months of pretending, about the mission that had preceded his knowledge of her existence, and he watched her face close like a door he had never learned to unlock. What would she do with the knowledge that their meeting had been coincidence while his protection had been strategy, and could love survive the revelation that care had been indistinguishable from surveillance? The lawyer's call came at 9 a.m., routed through 3 jurisdictions to reach a phone that wasn't registered to any name Julian's investigators could trace. The voice on the other end spoke with the precision of someone who billed in 6-minute increments, who had never lost a case because she refused to accept cases that could be lost, who specialized in the kind of justice that didn't make headlines but made careers end. In calling for the individual who accessed the Pembroke Foundation servers at 3:47 a.m. on the date in question, she said, and Phoebe felt her blood freeze because that individual was Adrian, and the call was proof that his hidden identity had been penetrated by someone outside their shared secret. She answered with the code he had given her, a sequence of words that meant nothing in isolation but everything in sequence, and the lawyer's tone shifted from professional to personal, the warmth of someone who had been waiting for this case for years. "Your friend has been preparing this for 6 months, she said, but he forgot to prepare for you." The conversation lasted 40 minutes, during which Phoebe learned the architecture of Adrian's mission, the regulatory complaint already filed under seal, the injunction waiting for the right moment to unseal, the criminal referral that would trigger if Julian attempted to destroy evidence. She learned that Adrian had been someone else before he was a security guard, someone with credentials and authority and a grief that had driven him to accept an assignment that required erasing himself. She learned that the lawyer's call was a test, a way of measuring whether Phoebe would protect him or use him, whether her love was robust enough to survive the transition from secret to public. When she hung up, she found Adrian in the basement corridor, his posture suggesting he knew what she had learned, his eyes asking a question he couldn't voice. "You should have told me," she said, and he agreed, and in that agreement they found the first honest ground their relationship had occupied. But what would happen when the lawyer's involvement meant his exposure, and who would protect him when his protection of her had made him visible? The pressure to confess came at noon, delivered in a conference room that had been cleared of recording devices by lawyers who didn't know Adrian had already mapped its electromagnetic signature. Phoebe sat across from Julian himself, no longer mediated by assistants or security chiefs, the full force of his charm turned to the task of breaking her will with the appearance of kindness. He offered to drop the theft charges, to provide a severance package that would cover her aunt's care for 2 years, to write a recommendation that would allow her to work in less sensitive environments, all in exchange for a statement that Adrian Sykes had manipulated her, had planted documents, had used her poverty to access the Foundation's secure areas. The narrative was elegant: the poor as victims of other poor, the wealthy as benevolent rescuers, the truth as a commodity to be traded for survival. Phoebe listened with the stillness she had learned from Adrian, her face revealing nothing while her mind calculated the cost of refusal, the mathematics of love versus survival that had no clean solution. Julian produced the false confession his lawyers had prepared, the paragraphs constructed to sound like her voice while incriminating the only person who had treated her with dignity, and he placed a pen in her hand with the confidence of a man who had never been refused by someone who couldn't afford to refuse. She thought of the 3 seconds in the corridor, the microscopic nod, the way he had seen her without consuming her, and she understood that signing would save her aunt but destroy the only evidence of her own visibility. The rich were rehearsing the story for press even as she hesitated, a press release waiting to be distributed that would frame her as troubled but brave for exposing Adrian's exploitation, and she felt the weight of their preparation pressing down like a physical force. What would she choose when the pen in her hand could write either survival or betrayal, and how did one live with a choice that saved the body while scarring the soul? The whistleblower file surfaced at 3:00 p.m., not through the channels Julian controlled but through the regulatory system he had believed himself above, delivered with a chain of custody that bore Adrian's authentication codes and Phoebe's witness signature. But the file was booby-trapped, its metadata containing triggers that would alert Julian's legal team the moment it was accessed by anyone outside the original submission protocol, its contents encrypted with a key that required both of their biometric inputs to unlock. They worked in the basement corridor, the only space where Adrian's counter-surveillance confirmed safety, their fingers touching the same screen as they entered the sequence that would either liberate the truth or destroy it. The file opened to reveal not just documents but video, audio, the digital fingerprints of Julian's crimes that predated his current philanthropy and explained his current paranoia, the history of a man who had learned that reputation was more valuable than legality. But the booby trap activated as they watched, a remote wipe command triggered by Julian's lawyers the moment they detected the access, and Adrian's fingers moved with the speed of training, creating a local backup that the remote command couldn't reach, severing the network connection that would have completed the destruction. Phoebe watched him work, saw the competence that his security guard persona had hidden, saw the grief that had driven him to this mission made visible in the urgency of his protection of evidence. The file survived, but its survival created a new vulnerability. Julian now knew that the whistleblower's evidence was in play, that his destruction protocols had failed, that someone with professional capabilities was targeting his empire. He would escalate. He would use the full force of his legal and financial resources to find them, to silence them, to destroy the credibility of the file by destroying the credibility of its guardians. What would they do when the hunter became the hunted, and how did two people who had learned to love in shadow survive in the full glare of exposure? The revelation came not as a confession but as a proof, the accumulated weight of planted details finally bearing fruit in a verification that transformed everything that had come before. The regulatory office called at 5:00 p.m., requesting authentication of the whistleblower file's chain of custody, and Adrian provided codes that no security guard should possess: audit identifiers, metadata verification keys, credential fragments that matched records in a database Julian's investigators had never accessed. Phoebe watched him speak with the fluency of authority, his posture shifting from the compressed humility of poverty to the expanded confidence of professional power, and she understood that the man she had loved in the corridors was the same man but differently arranged, his true self emerging from the costume of necessity. The proof accumulated: his precise note-taking, which had been audit documentation; his quiet familiarity with legal language, which had been professional training; his controlled reactions to Julian's crimes, which had been strategic patience rather than powerless observation. The file's authentication trail led back to him, not as guardian but as originator, the undercover auditor who had initiated the investigation that the whistleblower had continued, the first domino in a chain that was now collapsing Julian's constructed reality. He explained what he had never been able to explain before: the grief that had driven him to accept this mission, the personal loss that had made Julian's particular crimes unbearable to witness, the 6 months of erasure that had led to her and to a love that had complicated every calculation of cost. Phoebe listened, and in listening found that her love had not been diminished by his hidden identity but expanded by it. She had loved the security guard, and she loved the auditor, and she loved the man who had been both by being neither fully. The revelation created new dangers and new possibilities. He could now act openly, could deploy the full resources of his professional identity, could transform their defensive position into active prosecution. But openness meant exposure, and exposure meant that Julian could target them directly, could use his wealth to attack Adrian's career and Phoebe's fragile stability, could turn the legal system that should protect them into another arena of wealth's advantage. What would they build from the ruins of his hidden self, and how did love survive the transition from secret to public without becoming performance? The collapse came at 7:00 p.m., not with violence but with the implosion of constructed reality, as the planted proof Julian had manufactured turned against its creator through the very mechanisms he had used to build it. The regulatory injunction unsealed, triggered by Adrian's authenticated complaint, freezing the Pembroke Foundation's assets and preventing the destruction of evidence that Julian had already attempted. The criminal referral activated, based on the file's documentation of obstruction and the false statements Julian had orchestrated, transforming his legal team from attackers into defendants. The donor board removed him, not from morality but from liability, their fiduciary duty requiring distance from a founder who had become a legal risk, their announcement timed to coincide with the evening news cycle that Julian had planned to use for his own narrative. Phoebe stood in the same ballroom where she had been humiliated, now emptied of donors and filled with federal agents who treated her with the respect due a witness rather than a suspect, her name cleared not by mercy but by the weight of evidence that could not be denied. Adrian stood beside her, no longer in security uniform but in the professional attire that matched his true credentials, his hand finding hers with the confidence of a man who no longer needed to hide his capabilities or his care. The justice was real but incomplete. Julian would face charges, would likely negotiate a settlement that preserved some fraction of his wealth, would never experience the poverty he had weaponized against others. The emotional scar remained, Phoebe's trust in systems permanently damaged by their demonstrated willingness to serve wealth, her love for Adrian complicated by the knowledge that his protection had begun as professional obligation. They survived, together, in a changed form, love not as rescue but as mutual reconstruction, two people who had learned to see each other in the dark now learning to be seen in the light. The gala's chandeliers still hung above them, but their light seemed different now, less cruel, merely electrical rather than judgmental. What would they build from the ruins of their hidden selves, and how did one live after the story ended and the ordinary began? The chandeliers dimmed at midnight, not for drama but because even buildings must rest, and Phoebe Calloway stood in the empty ballroom where her humiliation had become her vindication, her hands still finding Adrian's with the surprise of contact that no longer needed to be hidden. They had won, if winning meant survival with scars, if victory meant the right to continue loving in a world that had tried to make their love impossible. Julian Pembroke's empire would collapse in slow motion, the legal process grinding through negotiations that would leave him wealthy but disgraced, the worst punishment for a man who had valued reputation above all. The whistleblower file would become precedent, would change how foundations were audited, would protect future workers from the specific machinery that had tried to destroy Phoebe Small justice, but real. She thought of her aunt, of the care that would continue because Adrian's mission had succeeded, of the rent that would be paid because her name had been cleared, and she felt the weight of gratitude mixed with the grief of what the battle had cost her trust. Adrian was no longer hidden, no longer pretending, and she was learning to love the man he had always been beneath the costume he had worn to survive. Their romance would be slow, scarred, honest, no longer intensified by danger but deepened by the ordinary challenges of two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable. The community that had watched their story, that had rooted for justice and for love, would find in their survival a model for resistance, a proof that the quiet ones could prevail, that the invisible could become visible without becoming targets. If this story moved you, if you believe that truth deserves protection and that love can survive the systems designed to crush it, leave your mark below. Like for the workers who clean the floors where empires fall, comment with the name of someone who saw you when you were invisible, share this with anyone who needs to remember that justice is built not by heroes but by people who choose not to look away. Subscribe for more stories where the powerless become powerful, where the endings are earned rather than given, where love is not the reward for virtue but the practice of survival. The next story waits in the shadows where the rich never look, and we will be there to tell it when the light finally finds it.